Hello, everyone. It's so nice to speak with you today. I am Mary Becker, and I work in recruitment and retention at the Center for Clinical and Translational Science, also referred to as the CCTS, here at The Ohio State University. In our recruitment and retention program, we work with study teams, that being the PIs, clinical research managers, and study coordinators, to help design those first touch points with the community and share best practices to help researchers achieve the recruitment and retention goals of their clinical trials. Today I'll be discussing plain language as it relates to health literacy, plain language tips, readability, and resources. To begin, I would like to give you a little background and something to build upon before we dive into discussing plain language. I think I speak for many people out there when I say that understanding healthcare is like understanding a foreign language. Confusing, time-consuming, and for many, unrealistic. But as the push for patient engagement in the clinical space becomes a focus, many providers and clinical researchers, such as yourselves, are now working towards the goal of improved patient literacy. And I think that now would be the time to make the point that the use of plain language and increasing health literacy go hand in hand. We know that health literacy levels are low in the U.S. Only about 13% of English speakers in the U.S. have proficient levels of health literacy. If you say that another way, that means about 87% of people, or 9 out of 10 people, can really use extra help with health-related information, and they can benefit from simpler, clearer health information. And yet, patient health literacy is essential to quality health care. And just to be clear, patient health literacy is not a patient problem. It is a provider one. It's up to nurses, doctors, and clinical researchers to help those patients and participants understand. It's not just about finding simpler words for language that we think is important. It's also rethinking how we communicate and making sure we use imagery, visualization, and principles of numeracy. So let's finally get to it. As I stated earlier, I will try and keep this simple, so I will be answering the question, what is plain language? Sharing some tips about plain language and readability tools, and also share related resources. Let's begin by defining the term plain language. Simply put, I believe the best definition I have heard is that plain language is communication your audience understands the first time. I think I like this definition because it sets our goal for using plain language, and that is understanding. You don't want people reading your material to have to work really hard to understand it. By using plain language, your readers can understand your documents quicker, readers call less often for explanation, they make fewer errors filling out forms, and they comply more accurately and quickly with requirements. Given that clinical communications can be very technical and complex, using plain language can help clearly explain information so that the target audience has a better chance of understanding. Keep in mind, too, that plain language is a whole set of principles that include content, format, and the words you choose, and that includes readability as well. And we will get to more on that in just a few minutes. Having now defined what plain language is, let's move on to talk about some tips for using plain language. Writers who use plain language begin by engaging their readers and considering what they need to know. That means figuring out what is important to and for them, and organizing your content to serve your audience. What does that mean? That means to present only the most necessary information. You don't want to overwhelm your audience, so only try to give them the most necessary information. As the Roman statesman, lawyer, scholar, and philosopher Marcus Cicero argued, when you wish to instruct, be brief. That men's minds take in quickly what you say, learn its lesson, and retain it faithfully. Every word that is unnecessary only pours over the side of a brimming mind. Another part of this organizational piece is that you want to aim to put the most important points the audience should know first, and place the other points in order of importance. May sound obvious, but you would be surprised at how often people don't take that into consideration. And lastly, you want to describe what the audience should know or do in a way that makes it easy for them to take action. I will say that this last part is oftentimes forgotten by researchers and the like when it comes to the recruitment portion of their clinical trial. Here's an example of a flyer that was created for a study, but it leaves a bit to be desired. You'll notice there is not a lot of key information shared, and there are assumptions being made that may not be true. There is an assumption as to why someone would want to get involved. In this case, money. This is certainly sometimes true, but oftentimes there are more altruistic reasons. For example, they may have a family member that may be suffering from a certain disease, or maybe they themselves have, or they currently are. In the case of this recruitment material, more information would need to be added. What is this study about? Add eligibility requirements. Tell them the information they need to know for them to decide if they want to participate, if they qualify, and who or how to find out more about becoming a participant. I've talked a bit about why and how to use plain language, so let's for a moment discuss how to write clearly using plain language. Quite simply, writers who use plain language when writing, write clearly. What does that mean, write clearly? Well, let's take a look at some suggestions. Try to avoid using gender-specific terminology unless relevant to your study, and avoid using long strings of nouns and instead use short sentences and paragraphs. Use an active voice and verbs rather than negative words. Do this and do that versus don't do this and don't do that. And finally, choose correct words. And by that I mean using common words and phrases rather than undefined technical terminology. Use words and phrases your audience knows. Plain language doesn't mean removing key technical or medical terms. It just means defining them in clear and understandable ways. An example would be, instead of using the word chemotherapy in your document, instead try saying, a treatment where drugs are used to kill cancer. Resources are available to help support using clearer language in health medicine. Displaying your information correctly is also an important component to the use of plain language, especially in recruitment materials. Attractive documents are more likely to keep your reader's attention. Appearance can also improve a reader's understanding and retention of the information. Some things to remember. Headings and text boxes are your friends. Use them liberally and often. Sentence length should average 15 to 20 words. Lists and tables make complex information more understandable, and they may require fewer words than straight text. Leave ample white space between sections and paragraphs. Use bullet points to highlight information. And finally, check, check, check. It is important to have someone else review your document. Oftentimes, the best reviewer is not the writer. You need to have someone check grammar, correct spelling, and punctuation. Check for clarity and also brevity. Sometimes we have a tendency to get carried away when we are passionate about our topic, and having someone come in and maybe remove some extra words and even sentences can help make things clearer for the reader. It's also important to remember to check dates as well as page numbering and consistency. Before I wrap things up, I did want to say a few words about readability. There are plenty of readability and plain language tools out there to help you. Readability tests can help frame your revision process and tell you where you might need to make changes. Readability tools are not perfect, but they can be helpful and get you thinking about the best way to write for your audience. It should also be noted that people usually read about 5 grade levels below the level of education they have finished. On average, we know that folks read between a 6th and 8th grade reading level. And we also know that there are a lot of factors that can impact that level and bring it down even farther. Patients or participants in a stressful environment or someplace new or noisy or distracting will have trouble reading or understanding what a provider is saying. This can also be true when a patient is getting a new diagnosis or receiving difficult or technical information. To quickly and succinctly wrap this up, it's important to remember that using plain language nearly always helps people understand complicated concepts and provides the best outcomes for patients, participants, providers, and researchers. The final slides contain resources that pertain to the information that has been shared in this presentation. Additionally, I have cited sources that were used in gathering information for this presentation. I want to conclude by encouraging you to take the time to research further the resources I have shared with you about using plain language and readability, and start putting it into practice in your work, whatever that may be. One final quote from Marcus Quintilianus, a Roman educator and rhetorician. He said, "One should aim not at being possible to understand, but at being impossible to misunderstand." Thank you for your time.